Well, welcome back, everybody, to Two Pastors and a Mic. My name is Shannick.
And I'm Corey.
And we are so grateful that you're with us today, joining us wherever you're listening from. Those of you on YouTube, yes, this is very awkward right now, but Pastor Corey and I are finally on the same side of the table. Maybe we will disagree a little bit, but maybe more so since we're on the same side. Maybe today's the day we agree on more things than not.
We always agree.
But we also want to say, as always, like, subscribe. Also, leave a review. We've had a lot of amazing reviews over the last few weeks, and we would love to hear from you. And just let us know how this podcast is encouraging you and just maybe inspiring or even challenging you where you're at right now in life or maybe your walk with Jesus. But we do want you to know that you're valued and appreciated, and thank you for joining us. Today we have a special guest with us.
An all-timer.
An all-time special guest with us. Him and his wife came in and led a marriage retreat here at Hill City, also going to be preaching for us. So definitely check us out on YouTube when the video is released of the sermon that he's going to be preaching. But we have good friend Bill Vanderbush with us on the podcast today, and we could not be more excited. I'm telling you right now, this is one of those episodes that I promise you, once you hear from him, not only does he have a smooth, and I'm just going to say sexy radio voice, but what he has to say has so much depth, and it's going to be just amazing. You will want to share this, get this podcast out to friends, to family. It's going to be one of those things where he's going to say some things and drop some things where you're going to have to ponder, you're going to have to think about, but also you're going to want others to dialogue with in the conversation that we're going to have today. So Corey's got a few things that he wants to kind of bring out, and then we'll just throw it over to Bill, and he'll let loose. Kind of, Bill, what we do on this podcast when we have guests in is we just want to hear what you feel like God is saying to you, to the body, in your life, some things that God's been maybe rocking your world with. But before we get there, Corey's just got a few things that he wants to throw out.
Yeah, I like to do this, especially because I know you're not going to appreciate what I'm about to say. But I have met my fair share of communicators, specifically grace communicators and non-necessarily grace communicators in the Christian world. And I get the privilege of oftentimes seeing people off stage and on stage. And you are one of the greatest communicators of grace in this generation right now, but he is better off the stage. And that is what I care about most, because I don't care about your message if it hasn't penetrated your life and how people view. And so I just appreciate your authenticity, your humility, your love. You give people genuine time and space. I've been watching you in the lobby interact with people from this marriage conference. It's almost like they're the only people in the room. And that speaks so much volume to me that it's one thing to hear you from stage, and you are an incredible communicator, but it's another thing to watch you live it out. And so I just appreciate your presence. You do have an incredible, sexy voice. And so you listeners,
They haven't heard it yet.
They haven't. You're about to hear it. I know. Hey, welcome to the show, Bill.
You guys are reminding me of the podcast that my friend Jim and I talk about doing, which we've never actually done before. We actually want to make it a TV show. We're going to call it Fathers Apostolically Relating Together, or the Fart Show. And
love it.
And what we do is like take some of our spiritual heroes and put them right in the middle, and we'd be on either side, and then we like fire questions at them before they can answer the question. You know, the other person talks over them, like answers for them. And we get to the end of the show, and they've never actually said anything. We finish by talking about how much they've sewed into us, and we really appreciate their input into our lives. And so we want to get Bill Johnson and all these guys that we just admire. And we just tell them, look, you don't have to do anything. Just sit there in this chair for like 30 minutes.
Apostolically
relating together. That's exactly right. It'd be great to have a conference,
A fart conference that you invite all.
We could do the wind conference.
Yeah.
You got so many one-liners. So I'm a really good note taker. I've got notes that in my Evernote files, if I just type in Vanderbush, so much content pulls up. And so, you got one shot, two pastors on the mic. I'm going to encourage all of our listeners. This is one of the guys that you need to go and purchase his books and listen to his podcast. It will impact your soul in an incredible way. You just released a brand new book. The book, I haven't read it yet, but Reckless Grace was incredible for me in my journey. You were here. The first time we met you was 2018, and you made a statement. I first heard it from you. so I'm going to attach it to your name. I actually put it in my most recent book that I released, giving you the credit for it. But you said that we are found in Christ before we are lost in Adam.
Oh, yeah,
And
wow. Yeah.
such a revolutionary thought that just gets the typical church person just riled up, right?
Yeah. Well, that comes from Ephesians 1:4.
Yeah.
God chose us to be in him from before the foundation of the world. So, yeah, God told Jeremiah, I knew you before I formed you, which means you could be known before you knew you could be known. So then what did he know? Because what he knew before he even formed us is who we truly are. And that means that we really have one assignment in this life. If we have one task in this life, it's to find out what God has always believed about us and agree with that. And that only requires that we let go of every lie and every label we've ever had that's ever been placed on us by somebody else, or even things we've thought about ourselves that don't reflect the nature of what the Father thinks about us. And so it requires a lot of unlearning. So I've become very fond of unlearning.
Isn't that our stories?
It's true.
The process of learning. So if you could share with our audience one thing, or who is Bill, or a message, even highlighting this new book, what would you share?
Yeah, I think we're growing into the maturity of childlikeness, really. And so the more I know about the Lord, the less I know. I come to God asking for answers, and he doesn't answer my questions as much as he questions my answers. And then he gives me more questions. So you kind of like move on in life knowing less. The more you get to know the Lord, the more you discover your union with him, the more you realize this eternity, this world of kingdom eternity blows up and just grows before you. So we're not narrowing down anything to a singular destination other than Christ himself, who is so much bigger, so much greater, so much beyond what we could imagine. I always like to say he's better than you think, and you cannot imagine him better than he is. And people say, well, I can imagine some pretty great things, and but the problem is if we can imagine, let's say, the limits of the goodness of God, if we say, well, God can be this good, but he can't be that good, right? If I can create a boundary in my mind for his goodness and a limit to his goodness that I can actually imagine beyond, I'm putting myself in a really, really awkward position, because subconsciously, without even saying it, I actually can create in my own mind a perspective that I am better than God. At least I'm better in my mind than God is in reality. And so that's why I say I don't preach the goodness of God to draw theological conclusions, which is the obsession of Christians. It's like, give me a theological conclusion, a foundation. Listen, the rock we have is Christ, and none of us know everything about Christ. We haven't. I don't think any of us are going to find ourselves, in eternity getting scolded by the Lord, saying, you told people I'm better than I am. And I just think it's impossible for us to do that. And so when I say you can't imagine him better than he is, it's people go, well, what are the theological conclusions we can draw off of that? And I'm like, just leave alone the theological conclusions based on that, and just rest in the mystery of being reconciled, rest in the heart of the Father, and just live loved, by the Lord, and let that be the posture of your existence. And there's something at living at rest in the heart of the Father that puts us in a place of people say, well, you believe in eternal security. I'm like, well, I don't preach eternal insecurity. I lived that for years as a pastor, in a Southern church, in a traditional denomination. I preached eternal insecurity. People say, once saved, always saved. I'm like, no, I was always saved once. I am. I don't know what do you want to do with that? I don't know. It's just you sort of like take the words that we've used to draw these like theological conclusions and just break the sentences a little bit, and it sort of opens up the ability for God to take us to places where maybe we didn't even know were possible. So
I love that.
Yeah, and speaking of rest, I just wanted to say one thing, and maybe you can elaborate on this because it's your story. But when I first met you in 2018, you talked about the story of going out into the hurricane and the revelation you got from that, and how that ties back into rest, and specifically the story of Jesus when the storm comes upon the boat where he's sleeping. If you could just elaborate, because I know for me that was so impactful.
I hadn't thought
why it was so impactful.
Yeah, so I actually got that tattooed on my arm.
Yeah, you're showing me that. I'm floored by that. is not the first person that's actually showed me a tattoo that was inspired by an illustration or a message. So now I'm really careful about the illustrations that I tell. I'm so glad you remembered that. I haven't thought about that in a long time, but we had just gone through this hurricane in Florida, and in the middle of the hurricane, I had this picture of Jesus and waking up out of the boat. Jesus is in the middle of a storm, and he treats it like it's a nap time, and then the disciples come and wake him up and say, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" Which is what circumstances tend to do. They tend to make us question whether or not God even cares about us, the goodness of God, right? And this is exactly what they did. They didn't ask him to save them. They just said, you don't care that we're perishing? Like, we're all going to die, and you don't care. You're not being very Christ-like right now, is essentially what they were saying. And so he gets up and rebukes the wind and the waves and rebukes them for not having, faith. And I always had heard preached that, well, they should have done what he did. Like, I gave you the authority to do it. If you wanted to stop the wave machine, why don't you go ahead and just unplug it yourself, right? Like, you speak to the wind and the waves. And so that was my initial thought. So I walked out into the hurricane, like leaned into it, like you do in the South. Let's go on the hurricane, like tree limbs flying by you and stuff. And I'm leaning into this thing, and I'm holding my hand out, like Gandalf, like, you shall not pass, that kind of thing. And the wind's just still howling. I'm commanding the wind to stop, and I'm yelling at the wind. And it's just, I look like an idiot out there, I'm sure. And finally, I felt like the Lord said, this wasn't what I was talking about. Like, I didn't ask you to come out and do this. And I'm thinking, do I have the wrong interpretation of this entire parable here? And suddenly I felt like the Lord said, what was I doing? Like, if I wanted to shut down the wind, I'd do it. But what was I doing? I'm like, oh, you were sleeping. And I realized in that moment, the greatest act of faith would not be to stand up and oppose the wind. The greatest act of faith would be to lay down and take a nap. And really, it's like, rather than exercise my own will to shut down the thing that's promoting fear, to be able to rest in the middle of the storm is really how you exercise the greatest authority over the storm. And so it was a download. It was kind of like this immediate download. I was beginning to learn, really. I say beginning. I was preaching a ton of things on union back then, but I was still beginning to learn what it looked like to live in reconciled rest in the heart of the Father, knowing there's no distance and separation between me and God. And how that, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to live it. So how that looks is find out what Jesus is doing and agree with it, right? So when I look at the parable or the story of not parable, but the story of Jesus in the boat in the middle of the storm, he has to stand up and shut down the thing that's generating fear in these guys, but there's no fear in him. So what if I take a fearless posture in the middle of the wind and the waves? I just lay down in the boat. I realized Jesus didn't mind wind and waves. He went out on a stormy night to walk on the water. And I used, you see the paintings of Jesus sort of piously walking, and it's really calm where he is, but waves and everything are all around him. I don't think that was it at all. He's a 30-something, early guy in his early 30s, and he's surfing. He's like boarding on the water without a board because he can, and which is amazing. It's like, what do you do on a stormy night? You get on the water. What do you do in storm and you're in the boat? You lay down, take a nap. He has no fear of the world that he's created as a gift for us. And so there's something about that. Bill Johnson has a statement that, you have authority over any storm you can sleep in. And I love that.
I like that. And if you are to look at what Jesus is doing, there's actually a quote that you have from your dad on 3 things that Jesus doesn't do or never does.
Yeah,
Why don't you elaborate on that?
Yeah, never worried, never hurried, and he never lived in the problem, always lived in the answer.
I love that quote. I have that written in my leadership.
Yeah, we look at the life of Jesus, and we see so many discrepancies between his existence and ours. He eats with sinners, and the religious people go, "What are you doing?" It's as if he's tolerating their condition. But we have a tendency to view sin as a physical or a legal or financial matter, when Jesus looked at it as a spiritually medical matter. It needed healing. And so, why does Jesus appear so tolerant of sinners? It's not like he would go into a cancer ward and make fun of people who had cancer or condemn them for having cancer. He looked at people who were locked into the delusion of sin, and he goes, oh, these people have a disease, and I'm the cure. So what am I going to do? Give them a blood transfusion. It's why James 5:16 says, confess your sins one to another, pray one for another, that ye may be healed. It's not an issue that involves payment and punishment. It's an issue that involves the need for supernatural healing, which is what the cross accomplished. And, we've kind of gone back to a payment punishment system, I think, in our day.
Unfortunately.
So, yeah.
You got a question? I got one more question for him.
Oh, no, I was just going to comment that's 6 years later hearing you tell the story again, and it's just as powerful as the first time I heard it.
Oh, that's cool. Thanks, man.
Yeah. Make your bed in the boat.
Yeah.
I love it.
Take a nap. If Jesus is napping, I think about it now and I realize, man, I think about all the things that I get panicked about, and I should probably stop and go, wait, if Jesus isn't freaking out, what am I doing?
And it's so challenging to live there, right? Well, before we close and talk about your newest book, the last quote I want you to elaborate on actually has to do with freedom, because, as someone who we teach, obviously, grace and freedom, and we get labeled a lot of certain things, specifically in this area. You have one of the greatest quotes that I actually use for people when they're like, oh, well, grace is just a license to sin, all that BS. But you have said it's not your ability to keep the law and rules that demonstrates your character. It's your ability to manage freedom. And what you choose to do when you're free to do anything is what reveals the condition of your heart. One of my favorite things you've ever said, at least for me personally.
Love that.
Because it helps at least respond to the people that really don't actually understand grace and think that it's a license to sin. When it's actually the opposite. And it reveals motivation, which I think is the key to following Jesus. Is what's your motivation for following Jesus? Because that reveals everything that you believe about the Father.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, what you choose to do when you can do anything says a lot about you.
Oh yeah.
And you think about people in prison, when their options are reduced to nothing, it's an easy to manage lifestyle when you're basically told you have 3 choices, of what you can do, right? And you're confined into a prison system. I know down in Texas, we used to do a lot of prison ministry, and they would say 87% of the people who would leave the prison system would come back into it 2 years later. And the reason is because once their options went from 3 to 3 million, or whatever it is, you come out of the prison system, you got a choice of so many things to do. Because they'd never been taught how to manage freedom, they freaked out. And as a matter of fact, we have a lot of people who came out of the prison system who would come into our church, and they would want to know what the rules are. And basically, they weren't looking for freedom. They weren't looking for grace. They were looking for another prison. And I think that's what makes religion, prosper so much. But anyhow, learning to manage our freedom is really a big deal. People say, I've been given that label a lot. You give people a license to sin. I say, are you kidding me? First off, people have been sinning just fine on their own. Nobody's been asking me for permission, right? Pastor, can I go sin, please? Give me a license to sin. On top of that, I wouldn't give away a license to sin. I would sell those things. You know how much those would be worth?
Right?
I mean, my goodness, you go I go print off 10 licenses to sin every Sunday, and right, yeah, they could indulge, right? They could go out and wait, no, that's already been done.
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
Shoot.
Yeah,
we got to go back.
It's not even a new idea.
I know, dang it.
A lot of cathedrals in Europe were paid for with a lot of sin.
Facts.
Yeah, it's true.
So beautiful. So why don't you unpack this new book and where people can find it and kind of the heart, because you shared a little bit at this conference that you were doing where it kind of stemmed from and how you never intended it to be published. So,
Unveiled Horizon: Reflections on the Nature of God was a book that was, I would say, born in the secret place with God. By secret place, I mean it's not that you're writing for the purpose of you're not writing for the purpose of educating an audience. You're writing for the purpose of documenting the thought processes that are born out of conversations with God when you feel like everything you believed in is either being refined or challenged. And so, in other words, I'm writing down things I'm not even 100% sure I agree with this stuff, what I'm talking about. And yet, it's being stirred in my heart, provoked in Scripture, and born out of times of prayer. Prayer for me and God, prayer is just conversation, right, between us and God. There's a lot of listening involved, but the listening comes from questions. When the Bible tells us we have not because we ask not, my conversations with God are not so much petitions for God to come and do something as much as questions, because I realize that within the conversation, everything that He speaks gives me an empowerment to do something I couldn't do before. That's why Peter says to Jesus walking on the water, if it's you, tell me to come. Because he knows that in the declaration is the power to achieve what's been declared. So my conversations with the Lord would be things like, I want to talk about something I don't know, I don't understand. And so, sharing, just openly verbalizing questions to God. The crazy thing is when you're willing to ask a question to God, the answer will come almost as quickly, if not quicker, than the question itself. And so I'll tell you, here's a kind of funny bit of insider information, and that is about a dozen years ago, I said to the Lord, I want to preach on a different level. I want to preach at like a place that transcends where I currently am now, because all I can see is just a lifetime of just diving into study to teach. And I felt like the Lord said, I want to flip that around. Don't study to teach, study to learn. All you're doing is absorbing information. I'm going to give you wisdom and revelation, put it in you, and then give you the language to be able to release it. But in order to do that, you're going to have to preach beyond your own understanding. And I'm like, how do you even do that? How do you preach beyond your understanding? Well, shortly after that, a very strange and supernatural thing started happening while I would preach, and that is I would hear a question. And I do all the time. As a matter of fact, that's what happened this morning in the session this morning. It kind of went off the rails a little bit. I would hear a question, and it was almost like I could hear a question on the heart of a person that was sitting in the room. And it would come like almost internally audible, but I could hear it directionally. Like now I can tell where they're coming from, like in the room, in the general area. So often the questions that come would be a question that I didn't have an answer to when I would initially hear it. But if I would acknowledge that the question exists, the answer would begin to form. And suddenly I would speak an answer to a question that I heard in my spirit that I've now come to realize is coming from a person in the room. And in that place, God does a couple of things. One of the cool things he does, he makes you look like a genius. He makes you look like you know way more than you do. But I'm learning. A lot of times in the middle of this little Q&A session while I'm preaching, I'm learning right along with people. And it's not that I'm making stuff up. It's that you suddenly just have a wisdom and knowledge that comes beyond your understanding. You're preaching beyond your own understanding. And that's always really, really a beautiful thing to have happen. Well, I've taken that and I've adapted it to my private time with God. And so I'll sit down and go, okay, these are questions that came up in teaching times, but I have some questions just between you and me. And Unveiled Horizon was born out of that. So one of the things that happens, and I think I can address this on this podcast, one of the things that happens that when you start preaching on the goodness and the grace of God is people will start to label you real quick. And these days the big label is, oh my goodness, you're a universalist, right? So I get that a lot. And so I've been asking the Lord lately, give me language for this. I'm having to address this on a regular basis. And it used to come from a place of challenge. Now it's coming more from a place of curiosity, because people are like, wait a minute, we can't necessarily put a label on you that we don't fully understand unless we're only going to use that label as a reason to cancel you, right? And the reason to shut you down, rather than to understand a little bit about where you're coming from. So first off, when it comes to universalism, we've had to break this down into like four different areas, but I'll hit three real quick. We have universal atonement, which everybody agrees is orthodoxy. I think there's no Christian on the planet that doesn't believe that Christ died once for all, right? But then we have on the other end of the spectrum a universal adoption or universal salvation, where everybody's in, doesn't really matter. It's just a done deal. It's like what, So I push back against that only for this reason. It's not that I don't believe that Christ can't save us all or that he hasn't saved us all. I think he absolutely has provided salvation for every human being. But one thing I see throughout the scriptures is that he absolutely has a high value for freedom. And again, going back to that thing about managing freedom, he gives us a dangerous level of freedom. And so a lot of times I think people will go out and they'll exercise freedom in the same way that kids rebel against their parents by going out and doing things their parents don't want to do to see if they can provoke a response, or exercise power. They want to feel powerful and want to feel in control. We do that same thing sometimes, I think, to try to exercise or provoke a response from God. And I don't think it's even, it's a reality. I mean, I've done that in my life. I mean, that's one of the reasons why as a young person, I was a bit of a scoundrel, because, when when I'm questioning even the validity of the belief in the goodness of God or even the presence of God, I'm thinking, well, if I do something that God absolutely hates, certainly he'll show up, or at the very least send an angel to come and slap my hand and tell me to knock it off. And when that doesn't happen, you got one of two choices. Either God is neglecting me, doesn't exist, or he is letting me do this, right? He's actually giving me this freedom. Not that he's blessing it, but he actually is giving me the freedom to self-destruct. And so you begin to realize in people's life, they realize real quickly that God will honor your will to self-destruct. If my exercise of will results in my own self-destruction, that's not on God. That's on me. Because he's given me the Holy Spirit to teach me how to manage my freedom and actually walk in the beauty of taking that glorious freedom that I've been given and experiencing being loved by the Father, experiencing loving him back in return. Like I'm not in a headlock to do it. I don't have to, but I can. I'm invited into it. And so universal salvation over here on this end is where I think most people are kicking against, because it's like, well, what's even the point then of praying, reading your Bible, preaching the gospel? And so to kind of bring it into language, I think that will help everybody just to sort of at least come to some level of understanding. I land somewhere in this, what I would say is universal reconciliation. And by that, I mean that it's like God looking at humanity going, because of what Jesus did, we're good. And that's, 2 Corinthians 5, God was in Christ reconciling the cosmos to himself by not counting our trespasses against us. In other words, I refuse to let the thing that would disqualify you be put into your account. So from my perspective, God says to humanity, we're good. Well, I think the majority of humanity looks back at God and goes, no, we're not. And so you see in humanity a willful rejection. But I would suggest that what people are rejecting is not God. They're not rejecting Jesus. They're rejecting a concept that we have put on display, especially in Western Christianity, of a God that doesn't look anything like Jesus. So I like to say to people who are atheists, would you please tell me about the God you don't believe in? And they'll often respond with a description of something that looks nothing like Jesus. And I get done talking to them, I'm like, oh, well, guess what? I'm an atheist too, because I don't believe in that God either, because he looks nothing like Jesus. So let's talk about Jesus. Let me introduce you to Jesus, because Hebrews 1:3 tells me that Jesus is who God has always been. It's the exact representation of the Father's nature. So universal reconciliation says God has reconciled all things to himself. And it's like standing in an altar and one half of the equation is said, I do. Well, my I do on the other end of the equation doesn't save me. All I do is agree with his declaration over me. And so I like to say it like this. People will say, well, the Bible says Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. So then your belief is what saves you. And I'm like, well, how do you do that though? Like, how do you believe? Religion would like to say Abraham obeyed God and was accounted to him for righteousness. But the way God cut covenant with Abraham is he put him to sleep, did both sides of the covenant, then woke him up and tell him what he did. I mean, Abraham's involvement in that was like unconsciousness. So it'd be like me coming up to you going, hey, I'm going to pour this bucket of water on your head, and when I do, you're going to get $1 million in your bank account. Well, it makes no sense. All right, but how would you receive that? Just
pour it on me, baby.
Just don't move.
Yeah.
Just don't move. Here's how you would receive it: to offer no resistance. Because to grab an umbrella and to work to somehow stay dry would be more of an effort than just to stand there and receive my effort, right? And that would be believing. So I pour the bucket of water over your head and you hear your phone go ka-ching and you got $1 million in your bank account. What happened? You offered no resistance. You received the benefit of my declaration of what I was going to do, and you were just present. You see this in the life of Jesus. John 15:3, he looks at the disciples and goes, now you're clean through the word that I've spoken unto you. What did they do? Nothing. You were here while I was talking. Now you're clean. It's like, it's a death to religious pride, and it's a death to ego to simply look at the declaration of Jesus over your life and say okay to it. But that's, John 3:14, as Moses lifts up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Harkening back to the Old Testament story of the children of Israel grumbling, complaining, snakes coming and biting them, and then Moses goes, I'm losing everybody, what do I do? And make a bronze serpent, put it on a pole. Anybody who looks at it will be healed. And if I'm Moses, I got questions. Do I have to understand it, read a book about it, have a class about it? No, just look at it. Wait, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't feed the ego. You can look at it by accident. But that's all you needed to do. And so it's like we've made believing such a work. We've made believing such an effort.
Yeah.
And when I read the first 3 centuries of Christian writers and they talk about the relationship with Jesus, it always begins with what Jesus did, that the cross did this. That's all the sermons in Acts lead with, this is what Jesus did. What we did was contribute murder. We contribute bloodshed to our Creator. And what does he do? He gives us in return. He gives us grace. He gives us forgiveness. It's all about what he did. And I think the first 3 centuries of the church got that. But once we finally organized enough to create a formula for believing and give you an action that you have to do in order to be in, now, 2,000 years after the cross, you ask somebody, how'd you get saved? And it always begins with the same word, I. So somehow we've gone from what Christ did to what we do in response to what Christ did as a means by which we are in, as opposed to my only response is just to simply surrender and say, okay. So, how do you believe? Believe means to think to be true. And so, we find ourselves in a place of, I would say, what Paul does in 2 Corinthians 5 is he tells us we are reconciled. But then he gets to the end of it and he goes, so as an ambassador of Christ, I plead with you to be reconciled. In other words, here you are, so be who you are.
Yeah.
And that's evangelism in the new covenant to me, is to declare, this is what Christ did. Make a declaration of this is what the cross accomplished. So now, agree with it.
Declarations. We tell people all the time, it's not about inviting people to Christ, it's declaring Christ already in them. Awaken.
Yeah, and if they don't believe it, what's changed? Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
But what happens if they do believe it?
Oh, everything changes.
Everything. And that was actually the basis of the first book that I wrote called Reckless Grace. It's from John 20:23. Whoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven. It's almost like taking the brokerage of the grace of God and declaring it over people, but it requires that we actually believe that the cross did something.
And that teaching was incredible. So tell everybody where they can find you, find your stuff.
You can go to BillVanderbush.com. There's a lot of stuff on there. 3 things that I would really highly encourage people to is there's 3 studies that we've done. I say we, a dear friend and I named Don Wallabaugh, and he's one of the best Bible teachers on the planet. He's such a sweet guy and a true father's heart. We've known each other for many, many years and just one of the best friends I've ever had. He and I got together and decided to do a verse-by-verse New Covenant study on Hebrews, James, and Ephesians. And we call it the Christic covenant, borrowing from the first 3 centuries of Christianity, because they believed that the New Covenant was the covenant of Christ, covenant made between God the Father and God the Son. And so we didn't make it, we can't break it. That's why it's everlasting and eternal and better news than we can imagine. So Hebrews is where I would recommend people start. And you say, well, how much are they? It's a minimum of $1 to get the entire study. And we decided when we created these, and we spent hours and hours creating these things, put a lot into it. But when we got done with them, we decided to do something we've not done with anything else we produced and anything else I produced, and that is we decided essentially to give it away at a name your own price kind of a thing. We wanted people just to sow into it if they felt like they wanted to. But at the same time, we felt like what was being released in there, we didn't want to put any roadblock, financial or anything, into it. And so I know there's one pastor that paid $3, $1 for each study when they came out, and has been preaching them verbatim. So if you're a pastor and you need good sermon material, and you're looking for an actual biblical, New Covenant material, there's 1,000 sermons in here that people can preach, and $3 is the minimum. It'll save you a lot of Bible college, actually. If you.
Yeah, that is so good. So BillVanderbush.com. Go check it out. Buy the resources and use the resources however you see fit. But I know you're going to be blessed if you do. Bill, I just want to say thank you for joining us today, being a part of this podcast. And we say when we close out our services and events, and you heard it earlier today, and we actually close the podcast out in the same way. We actually like if you could actually close out the podcast today with "You're loved," and there's nothing you can do about it. How about you do that?
Awesome. Well, I can say from the bottom of my heart, with everything in me, and so much confidence that if Jesus was sitting right here, he would say, "You're loved, and there's nothing you can do about it."